and therefore, due to severe and continuous ethical lapses, compounded by an utterly insufficient commitment to the rigorous academic standards of the endowment, the Board of Trustees has made the difficult but necessary decision to immediately revoke the full scholarship awarded to Miss Sunid. Serena Vance. The words of Uncle Vernon sliced through the polite silence of the grand ballroom. He stood at the ornate mahogany podium, bathed in the blinding light of 3 news cameras. He was performing public hypocrisy, announcing my financial ruin to hide his own financial crime. He expected tears. He expected a protest, a denial, a collapse. That was his fatal miscalculation. Vernon believed I was a reactive person, someone who would break under the public pressure he engineered. He assumed my financial vulnerability meant I was also mentally weak. I maintained my cold silence. A deliberate. Aggressive stillness that gave him nothing to feed on. Inside, I was not afraid or hurt. I was calculating. He had forgotten one thing about my years of quiet observation. I learned to read the rulebook better than the arrogant man who thought he owned it. Vernon's entire attack was predicated on the belief that he was the only one in the family who understood procedural authority. I let the insult land, hearing it not as a verbal assault, but as the final click of the cage door. He was locking himself inside. His arrogance was beautiful in its stupidity. He had overlooked the single most crucial, forgotten document of the entire institution. My preparation was systemic knowledge, the original, decades-old charter of incorporation. It contained a mandatory, forgotten clause, requiring a detailed, public accounting from the recipient. Vernon had skipped it for years, relying on his self-appointed authority. By ignoring this technical mandate, he had left a perfect, unused activation switch dangling for me to find. I took one small, deliberate step forward, moving past the velvet rope. My expression remained entirely neutral, a stone face of cold silence. I did not speak to him. I did not acknowledge his lie. I simply reached the auxiliary podium, tapped the microphone to confirm it was active, and began to read. The text was not a plea. It was a formal, precise institutional audit, demanding the formal investigation I now watched unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly modulated for the cameras. I thank Director Vernon for providing this esteemed forum. As the designated primary recipient of the Vance family endowment, I am here today to fulfill the absolute, non-negotiable requirement of Article 3, Section 4 of the Fund's Charter of Incorporation. Vernon's face paled, the fake regret instantly melting away into dawning horror. He recognized the procedural language he had so arrogantly discarded. He knew, instantaneously, what that clause meant. I continued, deliberately amplifying the procedural language. My formal, public audit, which has now been transmitted to the requisite non-family legal overseers, identifies an accumulated shortfall of nearly $2,500,000 over the last 5 years. Funds that were legally earmarked for student aid, but which have, instead, disappeared into unauthorized administrative expenses. Vernon launched forward. He launched forward, his chair scraping back loudly against the marble floor. He was moving to shut me down, but he was too late. The words were already out, and they were not a student's complaint. They were an auditor's report, delivered in the only manner legally permissible to trigger the institutional response. The activation was complete. The trap was sprung. Vernon did not bother with niceties or deniability. He launched forward, his face mottled scarlet. His voice a strained whisper of pure rage. "Stop this. Stop it now." "Serena," he hissed, his hands slamming down on the auxiliary podium. He was attempting to use physical proximity and volume to reassert dominance. A crude tactic born of absolute desperation. He was accustomed to people folding under his aggression. I did not flinch. Nor did I step back. I simply held his gaze with my cold silence. The press, sensing a dramatic escalation, surged forward. Their flashes popped like celebratory gunfire. The cameras were recording Vernon's complete loss of control in excruciating detail. Just as he was about to grab the leather portfolio, a discreet, high-pitched chime emanated from the customized digital watch on his wrist. It was the internal notification sound reserved only for critical fund communications. He glanced down, his eyes widening from rage to a paralysis of disbelief. He was reading the automated legal alert I had prepared for. The formal filing of the charter breach, triggered by my public statement, had reached the remaining board members. The legally mandated response was now automatic, immediate freezing of all discretionary fund assets and activation of independent audit. The strategic battle was over. Vernon's arrogance, which had led him to believe he could stage a public execution without legal consequence, was his undoing. He stumbled back a step, the blood draining from his face. The system is wrong. This is a technical error. My internal monologue was cold, analytical, and smug. The system is not wrong, Uncle. It is finally, for the first time in 15 years, operating correctly. Vernon had been so focused on bypassing the fund's mission that he forgot the charter was a document of law. I had meticulously verified every detail. The non-family auditor was already appointed. The institutional transfer of authority was already complete. The cage had been sealed by his own paperwork. "This is baseless," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This girl, this student, is engaging in a malicious, libelous attack because her scholarship was revoked. She is mentally unstable." I simply lifted the microphone a fraction closer to my lips. My tone was calm, flat, and professional. Director Vernon is referencing the mandatory minimum distribution threshold for the endowment, a figure established by the founder in the Charter of 1968. My formal, public audit, which has now been transmitted to the requisite non-family legal overseers, identifies an accumulated shortfall of nearly $2,500,000. The figure was the necessary tactical payload. The entire narrative of the room flipped in that instant. Vernon's attack on my reputation had just become the financial destruction of his own authority. It was the most satisfying irony imaginable. One reporter, a sharp-eyed woman from a major paper, held up her tablet. She asked if the endowment's entire operating budget had been frozen by the Fiduciary Oversight Council, effective immediately. Vernon could only stammer. The freezing of the funds was the core destruction. The strategic confrontation had ended with an instant, suffocating legal blow. Vernon had evacuated the ballroom, fleeing the cameras that recorded his narcissistic rage. He retreated to a private executive study. I, meanwhile, had found a quiet nook near the executive elevators. A discreet message arrived on my secure phone, an encrypted transcript notification from a monitoring service I had hired months ago. It captured the audio from Vernon's private emergency line. "I don't care about the press." The transcript read, "I need you to reverse the freeze." It was triggered by that damn gratitude clause. Lloyd. It's an antiquated piece of paper. For God's sake. Find the loophole. I paused, reading the words twice, letting the silence dwell. Vernon's demand was an arrogant assumption that the entire legal system was merely a complex tool for him to wield. He was trying to smash the cage I built from his own years of deliberate legal negligence. Lloyd's response, as transcribed, was perfectly flat and coldly professional. With respect, Vernon, the situation is absolute. Article 3, Section 4, states clearly that once the mandatory public accounting is filed and a minimum distribution shortfall is confirmed, the activation of the independent review is immediate and non-negotiable. It is a fail-safe. The cage holds, I thought, a slow, undeniable triumph settling in my mind. So what? Just dissolve the damn audit, Vernon's text screamed, confirming his rage. Lloyd's next lines delivered the final say, crippling blow. To terminate it requires a 2/3 majority board vote. Yes. But it also requires a formal, clean statement to the State Attorney General's office, confirming zero financial impropriety. If you push for a termination vote now, you will be seen as obstructing a criminal investigation. The cold, precise word criminal was the necessary tactical payload of this fallout domino. Vernon was now legally isolated. His arrogant miscalculation assuming his legal team could simply override a mechanism he had ignored had just failed catastrophically. He was forced to move to his hidden financial records, the logical consequence of his legal firewall collapsing. I deleted the transcript file. Vernon was now alone. He was trapped between revealing his financial fraud or instantly facing felony charges for obstruction. Both paths led to his total annihilation. I was seated in the quiet, austere reading room of my law school library. Vernon's failure to smash the legal cage with his corporate lawyer had forced him into silent, frantic retreat. The consequence was the auditor's unhindered access. My secure laptop blinked with an incoming transmission. It was a time-stamped, encrypted alert from the non-family auditor. I opened the file. It was a dry, clinical list of initial findings. The title of the internal document was all I needed: Systematic Underfunding of Mandated Recipient Accounts, Fiscal Years 2019 through 2024. Vernon's financial abuse was confirmed. He had systematically starved the very fund he was sworn to protect. This was the logical consequence of the charter's fail-safe activating. The light was now shining directly on the financial crimes he had been committing under the cloak of his family name. I leaned back. The silence of the reading room amplified the satisfying irony of the situation. Vernon was a social parasite. His sin was not petty theft, but an arrogant belief that the suffering he caused was invisible. Collateral damage in his pursuit of personal luxury. He treated the endowment's books as ceremonial scripts. His enormous arrogance blinded him to the truth. If you underfund the mandated distributions, the numbers will always tell the story, regardless of how elegantly you disguise the siphoning. He had assumed no legally empowered eyes would ever be allowed to see the actual distribution numbers. The auditor's report confirmed that the shortfall I cited, the $2,500,000, was entirely traceable to 3 specific non-charitable accounts he controlled. My preparatory calculations were flawless. He thought he was hiding money from me. My internal thought process ran, cold and dismissive. He was hiding it from the law, which is much less forgiving than a single person. This finding was the critical shift. The audit was no longer a procedural check on compliance. It was a direct inquiry into criminal fraud. This was the necessary trigger for the next domino, the failure of his internal support system to contain the crisis. He had no more financial firewalls left to burn through. The criminal investigation had pushed Vernon into the most predictable form of panic controlling the narrative. Unable to crush the law itself, he tried to weaponize sentiment. I was finishing an entirely unrelated case study when my tablet displayed a breaking news alert from a minor society blog: Vernon Vance's wife hospitalized amid endowment scandal. I opened the article with a cold, detached amusement. The text claimed Aunt Carol, who had been scheduled to grant an exclusive interview defending her husband's integrity and questioning my mental fitness, had been rushed to the hospital with a sudden, severe flu. The interview was indefinitely postponed. Vernon was trying desperately to perform the level 11 gaslight. Since the auditor's findings of financial fraud were now public knowledge, his legal defense was crumbling. He needed a non-institutional voice, a family member to publicly re-establish the benevolent patriarch narrative he had used for years. I knew Carol was not hospitalized. She was merely unavailable. My internal silence settled into a profound smugness. Vernon's arrogance was not just financial. It was a profound miscalculation of human loyalty. He believed that because Carol was his wife, she was his property, and therefore her silence or her lie was his for the commanding. He failed to realize that his cruelty, the silent, parasitic abuse of her trust over decades, had finally eroded her obedience. He cannot comprehend quiet refusal, I observed internally. His rage is so absolute. He can only see compliance or open revolt. Carol offered neither. She gave him a bureaucratic refusal, which is the only language he understands. The public was already questioning the timing, the convenience of the sudden illness. The family was fractured because the truth was too ugly to defend. The failure of this proxy attack was a crucial domino. He had burned his legal firewalls. He had lost his financial power. He had exposed his criminality. Now, the most important element of his social shield, his family support, had ruptured. This domestic ruin left him with one final, desperate vulnerability to defend his external legacy. The need to save his $5 million vanity project was his next, inevitable, self-destructive move. The domestic rupture caused by Aunt Carol's refusal to participate immediately led to the next, inevitable consequence. When the law collapses, the money freezes. When the money freezes, the social standing must follow. I received the news alert while standing in a busy campus square. It was a brief, official statement from the board of the City Museum of Arts and Sciences. The lead institutional donor, a massive image-conscious bank, had abruptly withdrawn its $5 million commitment to the Vernon Vance Wing for Philanthropic History. The project was immediately shelved. Vernon had been officially excised. My internal world was silent, focused entirely on the crushing, beautiful symmetry of the moment. This was the true payoff, far exceeding the initial financial victory. Vernon was a legacy destroyer. He did not merely covet the money. He needed the monument. The museum wing was the proof of his status. He saw the $5 million building as the physical manifestation of his self-worth. His entire existence was predicated on the belief that he could inflict invisible financial suffering on the scholarship students and then use the stolen surplus to erect a highly visible, granite testament to his benevolence. His greatest arrogance was in believing that the foundation's rot would not spread to the shining temple of his ego. The arrogance of the dynasty demanded a public monument. I thought, he believed that image and money were interchangeable. He failed to realize that when the money is exposed as stolen, the image becomes radioactive. The major bank understood the calculus perfectly. They cared only about being associated with a criminal investigation. My activation of the charter and the subsequent confirmation of fraud had successfully weaponized the social elite's greatest fear. The collapse of the legacy project confirmed his total social isolation. This loss was more painful than any jail sentence because it was the public, permanent, undeniable statement that he was a failure. The only thing left for a man whose self-image is destroyed is a desperate, theatrical attempt to regain control of the narrative. The destruction of the monument to his own vanity left him entirely exposed. The self-incriminating interview, where Vernon openly admitted his contempt and systematic theft, was the final, devastating piece of evidence needed. He granted an exclusive, high-profile interview to a news channel, a desperate play to reclaim the narrative. I watched the clip later that evening. The interview began with Vernon attempting to deploy his familiar cold actor routine. He spoke of my supposed mental instability. He offered tears for the endowment's temporary difficulties. But the interviewer refused to stay on Vernon's script. "Mr. Vance," the interviewer cut in smoothly. "The non-family audit of the endowment shows a $2,500,000 shortfall over 5 years. Can you clarify why a majority of those funds were instead reallocated into an account listed under Vance Family Holdings Contingency Management?" Vernon froze. The question was precise, factual, and anchored in the irreversible reality of the confirmed fraud. His narcissistic rage was immediately triggered. "Contingency management is standard practice," he thundered, discarding the mask of martyrdom entirely. "These children, these students, they are volatile. They do not understand the sheer complexity of managing multi-million-dollar capital. I was protecting the legacy. I was preventing waste." He rambled. He admitted to the systematic underfunding, justifying it based on his own perceived intellectual superiority and his contempt for the students he had sworn to serve. I let the scene run, observing the man's complete psychological collapse. Vernon was a sadist who derived pleasure from feeling superior. His attempt to save face was, in reality, a full, public confession of his core motive. His ego, the very arrogance that made him believe his verbal dominance could overpower a financial ledger, forced him to talk when absolute silence would have been his only chance. "He cannot stop talking," my internal monologue noted. "He needs the world to understand that he is smarter than them, even as he is destroying himself. That compulsion to be right is the strongest witness against him." The interview was a complete, final self-immolation. It was admissible evidence. Every word he spoke provided the prosecution with the necessary admission of intent. His emotional instability, which he had falsely accused me of having, was now laid bare. He had sealed his fate with his own arrogant voice. The self-incriminating interview was the final, admissible piece of evidence. The Board of Trustees, already under intense legal pressure, held an emergency vote 2 days later. The results reached me as a sterile entipaz. 5-line email from the fund's temporary, non-family legal counsel. The email confirmed a unanimous vote. Vernon Vance was immediately and permanently removed as director of the endowment and stripped of his position as a trustee of the fund. I read the words slowly, savoring the finality. This was the true, irreversible destruction. Vernon had lost his money and his monument, but the loss of the title was the annihilation of his identity. My internal monologue was purely analytical. His title was his greatest possession. He believed the title conferred integrity, when in fact, he was its greatest threat. He cannot buy this back. He cannot charm his way back. Institutional removal is absolute. The email contained a secondary payload. The board cited my original, meticulous public accounting as the key instrument in revealing the systematic misconduct. The motion was passed unanimously to formally and retroactively reinstate my scholarship, not merely as a matter of generosity, but as an official act of recognition for my integrity in upholding the charter. Furthermore, the legal counsel was instructed to issue a public statement apologizing for the fund's procedural negligence and acknowledging the great professional risk taken by me. The official recognition was the institutional condemnation of Vernon's initial, arrogant attack. He had tried to ruin my name. The fund had now used its entire weight to restore it. I finally allowed a flicker of smugness to cross my face. The pauper he scorned was now the only member of the family to be officially validated and publicly thanked by the organization he had tried to destroy. The documentation of the removal and reinstatement had been forwarded to the prosecuting attorneys, completing the criminal case against Vernon. The board's decision left Vernon with absolutely no institutional recourse. He was an outsider, facing a confirmed criminal case. His only perceived escape, the ultimate expression of his cowardice, would be flight. The board's decision to exile Vernon stripped him of his final political armor. He was now merely a confirmed criminal, facing inevitable prosecution. For a coward like Vernon, who relied entirely on the illusion of power, the only logical response was flight. I did not have to monitor his movements directly. I had ensured his fate was sealed before he even conceived of running. The non-family auditor and the newly installed interim director had been subtly alerted that Vernon was an extreme flight risk. The news alert came late that night. A single, factual headline on a financial crimes wire. Vance Endowment's former director detained at International Airport. I opened the short report. It confirmed that Vernon had been attempting to board a corporate jet bound for a small, non-extradition jurisdiction. The authorities, having been alerted to the flight risk, intercepted him at the gate. I paused, absorbing the final, crushing irony of the situation. He had used the intricate web of international law to facilitate his life of arrogance. Yet, it was the exact systemic knowledge I had deployed the procedural mechanism of the charter that led to his final, most humiliating miscalculation. He truly believed he was untouchable. My internal analysis ran. Even now, cornered, his flight was not an act of surrender, but an act of arrogance. He assumed he could bypass the legal system entirely by exiting the jurisdiction. The pursuit of the scholarship money had led me to the charter. The charter had led to the audit. The audit had exposed the fraud. The exposure had destroyed his legacy and his title. The destruction of his title, finally, to force the arrogant coward to run. The domino chain was flawless. My own cold silence had allowed the truth to pursue him without interference. The report noted his appearance upon arrest disheveled, refusing to cooperate. He was stripped of his dignity and his freedom at the hands of airport security, not federal agents. The man who had organized a press conference to publicly condemn me for ethical lapses was now a common financial fugitive. With Vernon in custody, the criminal phase of the operation was complete. The only remaining piece was the full, formal institutional reversal of power. The empty director's seat at the fund was the final, logical focus of the entire process. The logical step, the final domino I had prepared for, occurred 1 week later. I received a formal letter requesting my presence at the Vance Endowment's administrative offices. I accepted the invitation with my characteristic cold silence. Arriving precisely at the scheduled time, the meeting was brief and conducted with clinical professionalism. Ms. Vance, the interim director began. The board has permanently ratified your scholarship and your status as a formal whistleblower. acknowledging that your procedural diligence saved the endowment from total insolvency. This was the institutional acknowledgement of the systemic knowledge I had deployed. Following the permanent removal and criminal indictment of the former director, there remains a critical, immediate vacancy on the Board of Trustees. The most senior trustee stated, "The Charter, in Article 7, mandates that any vacancy resulting from a gross moral or fiduciary breach must be filled immediately by a person whose integrity has been tested and publicly validated by the fund's own governance structure." He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. "You are, Ms. Vance, the only candidate who meets this criterion. We hereby formally invite you to assume the vacant trustee seat, effective immediately, with full voting authority." I maintained my cold silence, processing the sheer, perfect magnitude of the status reversal. 6 weeks ago, Vernon had declared me a disqualified pauper. Now, the very institution he ran was offering me the seat he had abused for 15 years. My internal monologue was the final elation, triumphant analysis of his arrogance. He judged me by my lack of money and my youth. He dismissed me as a simple recipient who was forced to grovel. He failed to realize that the procedural rules he thought were irrelevant became the only power that mattered. He valued the chair. I valued the charter that defined the chair. I simply nodded, accepting the heavy documents presented to me. "I accept the appointment," I stated, my voice clear and even. "My first priority will be the immediate establishment of new, rigorous oversight protocols for all administrative expenses, ensuring full compliance with Article 3, Section 4 of the Charter." I sat in the chair vacated by Vernon. I claimed it not through sentiment or family entitlement, but through cold, méticuleuse préparation. The pauper had become the patrician, controlling the fund that was once used to control her. The destruction was total, and the victory was absolute. The long shadow of the dynasty was finally broken.